You know Daenerys Targaryen from Games of Thrones, right? You remember that epic scene where she burnt down King's Landing with her dragon? Well, I've got some crazy news about her. There's literally a real-life queen who inspired her character. Yeah, almost all characters you see in Game of Thrones are inspired by real history. And guess what? The author of this masterpiece, George R.R. Martin, openly admits that he drew inspiration from the history. Take Daenerys Targaryen for example. Her inspiration mostly came from Olga of Kiev's character, and I'm sure the similarities will truly surprise you. Just like Daenerys, Olga of Kiev conquered a whole city to become the queen, but Daenerys did it with dragons and Olga of Kiev did it with pigeons. Unbelievable, right? But that's the real story. So who was Olga of Kiev? You can think of Olga as the original Daenerys Targaryen. Because there are no real-life dragons, she had to use pigeons to burn her city. And trust me that her victory was just as amazing as the Daenerys burning King's Landing with her dragon. Just like Dany, Olga had royal blood, but she wasn't next in line to be queen. So she spent a lot of time with her people, taking care of those in need and being fair to everyone. People really liked her because of that. She always responded to requests with a kind heart. Sounds familiar, right? Well, that's where the similarities begin. Olga, like Daenerys, the Dragon Queen, was a kind and loved soul. Olga didn't have enemies and was respected by the people she met, but she had a destiny to fulfill. She dreamt of fire and blood. In her dreams, Olga saw a burning city and an empty throne. She would walk towards the throne and try to touch it, but she'd wake up screaming before she could. These dreams haunted her for many years. This is where George R.R. Martin got this idea for Dany dreaming of iron thrones while ashes fell around her. But how do pigeons fit into all this? How did Olga manage to burn an entire city with pigeons? And how did she become cruel enough to harm so many innocent people? Olga became a saint for her people. In Game of Thrones, Dany helped slaves escape from their mean rulers. She says that freedom is their natural right and encourages them not to let anyone keep them in chains. The people support Daenerys to secure their freedom from their cruel masters. Eventually, they start calling her Misa, which means mother in their language. They call her that because she treats them kindly, just like a mother would, and gives them a new life. She stays tough and helps them get their freedom back. Similarly, Olga also helped people who were mistreated in her kingdom. Olga made everyone realize that they were human with a valued life. She told everyone that it's not okay to live a life of slavery. She treated slaves and servants with kindness, and her people loved her for it. If she found anyone being cruel with slaves, she would step in to stop them. Olga actually lived to help others, and for that, people started calling her a saint. Slaves had a special place for her in their hearts because she reminded them of their freedom. She showed everyone what it's like to live a life without fear. She showed her people that life is not just about who can rule who. She was the ray of light in people's life. She was their saint, their Misa. And they loved her like a mother too. They loved her like she was the holiest person in the world. This must have inspired George R.R. Martin to make the entire line of Targaryen kings and queens holy and different from the rest. But if Olga was such a saint, why did she burn an entire city? When did her heart get cruel enough to kill innocents? If you're a Game of Thrones fan, you might already know the answer to this. But if you don't, keep watching because the reason might drop your jaw. Literally, Olga married a king who was murdered mercilessly. Like Dany, Olga was married to a powerful king. It wasn't a love marriage, but over time, they grew to love each other. Much like Dany and Khal Drogo. Her husband's love gave Olga strength to deal with other rulers and rule their kingdom. While her husband was alive, they were a powerful couple, just like Khal Drogo and Dany. However, unlike Khal Drogo, who was poisoned, Olga's husband was killed in a war. After her husband passed away, Olga became the only one to rule the kingdom. It was her right as a royal. Similar to Daenerys, she bravely took on the responsibility. Many men challenged her claim, but she stood her ground with the support of her people. However, something was missing. and Olga started to become bitter and some might say a little mad. She experimented with fire and animals, trying to find ways to win wars without losing her own soldiers. Olga had a goal to conquer nearby kingdoms in honor of her late husband, who promised her the whole world. Her ambition was burning like wildfire. Did the people do nothing? Couldn't they see she was going mad? People turned against Olga after her madness. When people noticed Olga's odd behavior, they began to dislike her. Many of her advisors and enemies took advantage of the situation, spreading rumors and refusing to accept her as a ruler. They were against the idea of a woman leading them. They wanted a man, preferably themselves, on the throne. They used every trick to make people hate Olga and view her as a crazy queen. Their goal was to take over her kingdom. Gradually, people forgot about Olga's kindness and saw her as a mad queen who had no right to rule without a man by her side. This hatred turned her own city against her. Joined by a neighboring kingdom, they tried for days and nights to kill Olga and seize her throne. But she was always one step ahead. She was clever and resourceful. When her own city turned on her, she knew it was time to turn her dream of fire and blood into reality. If her people wanted a mad queen, she was ready to be the craziest queen ever, their worst nightmare, the Queen of Ashes. Similar to Daenerys, who faced rebellion from her own people, Olga had her city revolt against her. This anger and rejection forced Daenerys to become the feared Mad Queen. However, unlike Daenerys and her dragons, Olga only had pigeons at her disposal. But how did she use them to burn the city? Olga set the rival city on fire with pigeons. Olga didn't need armies to conquer the city. All she needed were pigeons. She was very clever. Well, after all, she learned war strategies from her beloved husband. Knowing that the best wins come without slaughtering armies, Olga made a super plan. She pretended as if she was willing to step down from her throne and told her enemies that she didn't want to be queen anymore. She said that they could have her throne if they brought her pigeons from all around the city. Her enemies thought that she's gone mad and weak and couldn't believe that she'd give up her throne for just a few pigeons. But they didn't know what Olga was cooking in her mind. They couldn't have guessed that this harmless-sounding request would bring about the end of their entire city. Her enemies spent some days and caught pigeons from different locations within the city. Once they had enough of those, they sent them as a tribute to Olga. But what Olga did with the pigeons surprised them, and they were literally shocked. She attached pieces of burning clothing to the pigeons' legs and set them free. The pigeons from different parts of the city flew to their nests, spreading the fire equally. In a matter of hours, the entire city was on fire. Pigeon after pigeon, Olga destroyed the city completely. Fire and blood, her dream became a reality. She fulfilled her destiny and became the Queen of Ashes. She felt no sympathy for the burning people, because to her, they were traitors who had turned against her. So basically, she won and stood as the ruler while her enemies burned. Delighted by their screams, Olga's enemies couldn't handle the massive fire consuming their city. After this crazy war trick, everyone was scared of her and no one dared to challenge her rule and accepted her as their queen. Then how does the story end for her? How did Olga die? Olga is rumored to be killed by her close generals. In the stories of both Daenerys and Olga of Kiev, there's a sad similarity. Daenerys was killed by her trusted Jon Snow because he couldn't tolerate the innocent people she killed by burning the city. Similarly, Olga, who was a real-life queen, was poisoned by her war general. He initially supported her as a queen but couldn't accept the senseless killing of innocents for power. He betrayed Olga by poisoning her food. Both Daenerys and Olga faced similar terrible deaths. They couldn't understand why they were betrayed by people they trusted. While Daenerys believed conquering a city in a day was a noble act, Olga accepted her fate as the Queen of Ashes, using fire and blood to claim her throne. These parallel betrayals added unexpected twists to their stories. This is the real-life inspiration behind Game of Thrones, and it actually shows how history influences the authors of the present time. History is filled with clever and unconventional figures like Olga,